The wind had a sound in that part of Colorado, a lonesome hum that scraped across the plains like a dull knife. It was early spring, a season of brutal indecision. The snow, heavy and gray from a long winter, was finally surrendering, melting into a thick, greedy mud that swallowed wagon wheels and broke the spirits of horses. The sun was a pale coin in a washed-out sky, offering light but no real warmth. This was a land that promised nothing and gave even less, a place where a man's worth was measured in the sweat of his brow and the silence of his suffering. Eli Whitaker felt the land in his bones. He rode with the easy slump of a man long accustomed to the saddle, his broad shoulders blocking the wind. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Boulder, picked its way through the muck with grim determination. Eli's face was a map of his life, tanned by the sun, creased at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the endless horizon. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the distant smudge of smoke that marked the town of Redemption and its railroad depot. He was 32 years old, and he was riding to collect a bride he had never met. The arrangement had been a matter of practicality, not passion. Mr. Abernathy, the town banker, a man whose heart was as starched as his collar, had brokered the deal. A client of his, a man of some means back east, had a niece in need of a husband. She was, according to the letter, of good character, modest and capable. Her uncle was willing to provide a handsome dowry, not in cash, but in 5 head of prime Hereford cattle to be delivered in the fall. For Eli, whose small ranch was clawing its way to solvency 1 calf at a time, the offer was too practical to refuse. He needed a helpmate, a woman to manage the cabin, to fill the crushing silence that had been his only companion for too long. He needed a wife. The idea of love was a luxury he believed had died with Martha, buried 3 years ago under a different, kinder sky. This was a transaction, a partnership. He would provide a home and protection. She would provide companionship and help. It was as simple and as barren as the land around him. The train was already hissing steam when he arrived, a black iron beast panting after its long journey across the continent. The platform was a clutter of humanity. Miners with coal dust etched into their faces, merchants in bowler hats, and a few weary-looking women clutching children. Eli tied Boulder to the hitching post and stood apart, his height making him easy to spot. He felt a familiar awkwardness settle over him. He was a man of horses and cattle, of open spaces and quiet work. Crowds made his skin prickle. He scanned the faces stepping down from the passenger car, looking for someone who fit the description of Miss Josephine Kane. He expected someone plain, perhaps a little timid, a woman whose circumstances had left her with few choices. Then he saw her. She was not what he had expected. She stood for a moment at the top of the steps, a still point in the chaos. Her dress was of a simple gray wool, but it was well cut, fitting a frame that was slender but not frail. A small, elegant hat was pinned to dark hair swept up in a neat chignon. Her face was pale, her features fine, but it was her eyes that held him. They were the color of moss, deep and startlingly intelligent, and they swept over the rough-hewn town with a sharp, assessing glance. Her lips were full, pressed into a line that revealed nothing. In one hand, she clutched the handle of a worn carpet bag, and Eli noted that her hands, even in the warming air, were covered by immaculate leather gloves. He pushed off from the post and moved toward her, his boots making a heavy sound on the wooden platform. "Miss Kane," he asked, his voice a low rumble. Her gaze snapped to his, and for a fleeting second, he saw a flicker of something, fear, maybe, or surprise, before it was gone, replaced by a smooth, unreadable calm. "Mr. Whitaker," she replied. Her voice was lower than he'd imagined, with a clear, educated cadence that sounded foreign in the dusty air of Redemption. "Welcome," he said, the word feeling clumsy on his tongue. He reached for her bag. "Allow me." Her fingers tightened on the handle for an instant before she relinquished it. "Thank you." As he led her toward his horse, the whispers started. He could feel them like insects crawling on his neck. He heard Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, mutter to her friend, "Look at her. Looks more like a city madam than a rancher's wife." The other woman clucked her tongue. "Too fine. She won't last a month out at his place. That wilderness will chew her up and spit her out." Josie gave no sign that she heard, her back ramrod straight, her chin held high, but Eli saw a faint tightening around her mouth. He felt a surge of protective anger, hot and unfamiliar. She was his responsibility now. He helped her mount Boulder, his hands spanning her waist. She was surprisingly solid, her body tense beneath his touch. He swung himself up behind her, taking the reins, and nudged the horse into a walk, leaving the prying eyes and wagging tongues of the town behind. The ride to his homestead was long and mostly silent. The trail climbed from the flatlands into rolling hills dotted with stubborn pines and skeletal aspen groves. The vast, empty landscape seemed to stretch on forever, a canvas of brown and gray under a sky that was too big, too indifferent. Eli was accustomed to the silence, but with her pressed against his back, it felt different. It was a heavy silence, filled with unspoken questions. He tried to make conversation once or twice, pointing out a distant mesa or the track of a deer in the mud. She would respond with a quiet, "I see," or "It's very vast." Josie, for her part, was drinking in the scenery with an intensity that surprised him. She was not looking at it as a threat, but as a map. She traced the contours of the hills with her eyes, noted the winding path of a half-frozen creek, the shelter of a rocky outcrop. This desolate, wind-beaten country was a fortress. Its emptiness was a shield. To her, after years spent in crowded rooms filled with the cloying sense of perfume and desperation, this raw, clean wilderness was beautiful. It was a place a person could disappear. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach since she'd boarded the train began to loosen its grip, replaced by a fragile shoot of hope. She could survive this. She had survived far worse. The man whose back she was pressed against was the key. He was quiet, his presence solid and steady. She could feel the hard muscle of his arms as he held the reins, smell the clean, faint scent of leather and pine smoke that clung to his coat. He was nothing like the men she had known. He was the unknown, and that made him both her greatest risk and her only salvation. It was dusk when they finally arrived. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the twilight. A sturdy-looking barn stood nearby, along with a series of corrals. It was a lonely outpost, a testament to one man's relentless labor against an unforgiving land. It was stark, but it was real. Inside, a fire was already banked in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the main room. It was one large space, containing a cast-iron stove, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a bed built into one corner. Everything was neat, meticulously organized. There was a surprising tidiness to the place. A sense of order wrested from chaos. "It's not much," Eli said, setting her bag down, "but it's solid." "It's a good home," she replied, her voice soft. She unpinned her hat, her movements fluid and graceful. Eli felt that awkwardness return. He was used to living alone, his routines fixed and solitary. Her presence filled the small cabin, changing its dimensions, its very air. He cleared his throat. "The preacher is expecting us in the morning. 10 o'clock. We can get the legalities sorted." He gestured to a closed door. "I've prepared the spare room for you. It's small, but the bed is clean." He had spent the entire previous day airing out the small storage room, fitting it with a narrow cot he'd built himself. He had laid his mother's old quilt over it, a splash of faded color in the plain room. He was trying to act with respect, to honor the woman he believed her to be, an untouched, delicate creature in need of gentle handling. Josie watched him, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She saw the way his large hands, calloused and capable, fidgeted slightly as he spoke. She saw the earnest, almost boyish concern in his gaze. He was a good man. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, a sharp, painful ache in her chest. His goodness was a spotlight, illuminating the depth of her own deceit. The lie she had so carefully constructed felt suddenly flimsy, a costume of rags she was wearing to a king's feast. For a moment, the urge to confess was overwhelming, to strip away the pretense, to tell him everything, who she was, where she had come from, the things she had done to survive, to tell him that her name was not her own, that the uncle was a fiction, a story concocted to buy her this one last chance at a life. But the words caught in her throat, choked by years of practiced silence. Fear, cold and familiar, wrapped around her heart. The truth was a weapon, and she knew too well how it could be turned against you. A man like this, a man of honor and simple truths, would not understand. He would look at her with disgust and send her back to the world that had nearly destroyed her. And so she held her tongue, pushing the confession down, burying it under the role she had chosen to play. She was Miss Josephine Kane, a respectable, modest woman. She would play her part until the curtain fell. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice steady. "That's very thoughtful of you." The wedding was as stark as the landscape. It took place in the preacher's cramped office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and beeswax. Preacher Miller, a man with more piety than warmth, read the vows in a monotonous drone. Eli's voice was low and firm as he spoke his part. Josie's was a soft, clear whisper. They signed the registry, their names side by side in black ink, sealing the transaction. Mr. Abernathy stood as their witness, his expression one of smug satisfaction. The whole affair was over in less than 10 minutes. They were husband and wife. The ride back to the cabin was even quieter than the day before. The word wife hung between them, heavy and strange. Husband? Josie tested the word silently in her mind. It felt like a costume she was still learning how to wear. That night, the tension in the small cabin was thick enough to cut. Eli had cooked a meal of venison stew, and they ate in near silence at the small table. He was a man adrift, unsure of the protocol. He was married. The woman across from him was his wife. He felt a nervous flutter in his gut, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He thought of Martha, of their gentle, innocent courtship. This felt nothing like that. This felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark. After they had cleared the dishes, he stood by the hearth, staring into the flames. Josie sat on one of the chairs, her hands folded primly in her lap, watching him. The firelight played across her face, softening its sharp angles, making shadows dance in the hollows of her cheeks. She was beautiful, he realized, in a way that was both unsettling and magnetic. Finally, he turned to her, his expression a mixture of apprehension and resolve. "Josie," he began, using her first name for the first time. It felt strange and intimate. I reckon we ought to talk." "What about Eli?" she asked, her voice calm. He took a breath. "This is your home now. I want you to feel safe here." He took a hesitant step toward her. He was clumsy in this territory, a stranger in the land of emotion. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he let it drop. He wanted to kiss her. It was his right, his duty as a husband, but he felt a profound uncertainty. He was afraid of frightening her, this quiet, elegant woman who seemed as fragile as a desert flower. He leaned in, his movements slow, telegraphing his intent. He aimed for her lips, his own dry with nerves. He expected her to flinch, to turn away, to offer her cheek, perhaps. She did none of those things. As his face drew near, she moved with a sudden, startling grace. She rose from her chair, her body flowing into his space. She lifted a gloved hand, she had not removed them, and laid it gently against his rough, unshaven cheek. Her touch was feather-light but sent a jolt through him. Her moss-green eyes locked onto his, and in their depths, he saw not fear, but a calm, knowing boldness that stole his breath. She tilted her head, a faint, mysterious smile playing on her lips. Her voice was a low, intimate whisper that brushed against his ear, a sound that was both a promise and a warning. "Now let me show you how I lie." Before he could process the strange, unsettling words, her other hand came up to cup the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair. She drew his head down, and her mouth met his. The kiss was not what he expected. It was not the chaste, timid press of lips he had anticipated. It was slow, deep, and devastatingly skillful. She tasted of tea and something else, something wild and faintly bitter, like sorrow. Her lips were soft but firm, moving against his with a confidence that left him reeling. All his nervousness, all his careful plans for a gentle initiation, dissolved in a rush of heat. He was no longer leading. He was being led into a deep, unfamiliar country. The intimacy that followed was a haunting fever dream. In the soft light of the fire, she undressed not with the fumbling modesty of a virgin, but with a slow, deliberate grace that was both beautiful and heartbreakingly sad. She guided him through the act with a quiet, practiced expertise that his simple mind could not comprehend. Every touch, every caress, every whispered sigh seemed designed to bring him pleasure. Yet there was a deep, sorrowful current running beneath it all. It was a performance of passion, so flawless that it felt more real than reality itself. For Eli, it was a revelation. He was lost in a sea of sensation, overwhelmed by a depth of passion he had never known. He was a simple man, and he took her skill as a sign of a deep, hidden well of feeling, a treasure he had been the first to uncover. But for Josie, it was different. As her body moved in familiar rhythms, her mind was 1,000 miles away. She was an actress playing the greatest role of her life. She had learned these arts in the cruelest of schools, where passion was a currency and tenderness was a tool. Yet, something was terrifyingly different this time. Beneath the layers of pretense, a strange and unwelcome hunger stirred within her, a hunger for this man's rough tenderness, for the genuine awe in his eyes. For the first time, while her body was lying, her heart felt a flicker of treacherous truth. It was a hunger for the very thing she believed she could never have, a love that was real. Later, as Eli slept, his body a warm, solid weight beside her, he murmured her name in a dream. He settled deeper into sleep, a faint smile on his lips, thinking she was a mystery, a puzzle box of a woman, and he was eager to spend a lifetime discovering her secrets. Josie lay awake in the darkness, listening to the lonely sound of the wind outside the cabin walls. She stared at the log ceiling, her body aching with a weariness that went far beyond physical exertion. She had survived the first night. She had kept him from seeing the truth, but as she felt the steady rhythm of his breathing beside her, a single, terrifying question echoed in the silence of her soul. How long could she keep him from knowing the worst? The first light of dawn was a thin, gray wash against the eastern plains when Josie rose. She moved with a practiced quiet, her bare feet making no sound on the rough wooden floor. Eli slept on, a mountain of a man under a simple wool blanket, his breathing deep and even, in the pale light. His face was unguarded, the hard lines softened by sleep, and a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar, almost like grief, went through her. She was a ghost in this man's house, a lie in his bed. She stoked the embers in the hearth, adding kindling until a small, steady flame took hold. She found the coffee grinder and the tin of beans, and soon the cabin was filled with the rich, bracing aroma. The work was a comfort, a series of simple, honest tasks that grounded her in the present moment. This was real. The heat of the fire, the weight of the iron pot, the clean smell of the pine logs that formed the walls. It was all blessedly, terrifyingly real. When Eli woke, the sun was fully up. He sat for a moment, disoriented. The cabin was warm, coffee was ready, and a pan of biscuits was browning in the stove oven. He saw Josie outside, by the water pump, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her dark hair catching the morning light. He had expected to find her asleep, a delicate city woman overwhelmed by the rustic quiet of his life. Instead, she seemed to have folded herself into the morning's routine as if she had been born to it. He dressed and went out to the barn, his mind still clouded with the memory of the night before, a confusing mixture of raw pleasure and a deep, unsettling sense of mystery. He found her there ahead of him. She was not admiring the horses or shrinking from the smell of hay and manure. She was standing by his workbench, holding a piece of bridle leather. The stitching had come loose, a repair he had been meaning to make for weeks. In her hands were his awl and a length of waxed thread, with movements that were quick, efficient, and precise. She was running a new seam, her stitches small and perfectly even. He stopped in the doorway, stunned into silence. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. She did not look up from her work. "You pick things up," she said, her tone light, evasive. "A person has to be useful." He watched her for a long moment. Her hands, which he had thought so delicate in their gloves, were steady and strong. There was a competence in her movements that belied the elegant woman who had stepped off the train. He had bargained for a helpmate, and it seemed he had gotten one. But the skills she possessed were not those he had anticipated. He had expected a woman who could cook and clean, not one who could mend tack as well as any ranch hand he had ever hired. Over the next few days, the surprises continued. She learned the rhythms of the ranch with an unnerving speed. She knew to scatter corn for the chickens without being told, knew how to bank the fire at night so it would be easy to start in the morning. She found his mending basket and, by the light of the fire in the evenings, she patched his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. One afternoon, he came back from riding the fence line to find she had taken a section of broken fence near the barn, a post rotted through at the base, and had repaired it herself. She had dug a new post hole, set a fresh post he had cut months ago, and stretched the wire tight, securing it with staples. Her face was smudged with dirt and her dress was stained, but there was a look of grim satisfaction in her eyes. He tried to question her, his attempts always gentle, almost shy. "That boarding school you went to?" he said one evening as she cleaned the supper dishes. "Did they teach you how to set a fence post?" A shadow passed over her face before she answered, her back still to him. "The school taught discipline. Eli, it taught that idle hands were sinful. There was always work to be done, mending, scrubbing, gardening. It was a cold place. There was little love in it." She spoke the words like a recitation, a story she had told herself so many times it had taken on the feel of truth. It was a shield, a carefully constructed history that was just plausible enough. She had indeed been raised in a place with much work and no love. She just omitted the name of the establishment and the nature of the work. His questions always met this same smooth, polite wall. He learned nothing of her family, of her friends, of her life before the train had brought her to him. She was a book with the first several chapters torn out, and the mystery of it gnawed at him. He was a simple man who understood simple truths. The sun rises in the east. Winter follows fall. A good horse is worth more than gold. Josie was not a simple truth. She was a complex, beautiful, and deeply confusing riddle. A week after their wedding, they had a visitor. A wagon rattled up the trail, and Eli recognized it as belonging to the Pettys, who ran a small spread 5 miles to the east. Agnes Petty was the closest thing they had to a neighbor, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as a branding iron. She came, she claimed, to welcome the new bride, but her eyes were cold and assessing as she took in Josie from head to toe. "Well now," Agnes said, her voice thin and reedy, She was a stout woman with a face like a sour apple. "Mister, Abernathy said you were a lady of refinement. I see he wasn't exaggerating." Her gaze lingered on Josie's clear skin and the graceful way she held herself. "You'll have to forgive our rough ways out here. Mrs. Whitaker, our hands are more used to lye soap than leather gloves." It was a direct, spiteful jab. Josie had stopped wearing the gloves inside the cabin, but her hands, though busy, had not yet acquired the calloused, work-worn look of a woman like Agnes. Eli stiffened, ready to defend his wife, but Josie simply inclined her head, a small, chilling smile touching her lips. It was a smile that did not reach her eyes. "On the contrary, Mrs. Petty," Josie said, her voice as smooth as cream. "I find the honesty of this place quite refreshing. One always knows precisely where one stands. Please, do come in for some coffee." The politeness was a weapon, and it struck its target. Agnes Petty was flustered, her petty cruelty disarmed by a poise she could not comprehend. She stayed for a half hour, her conversation filled with pointed questions about Josie's background and veiled warnings about the harshness of the life she had chosen. Josie answered each probe with unwavering calm, revealing nothing, her unsettling smile never wavering. The woman left in a state of visible unease, unnerved by a bride who was not at all what she had expected. As her wagon disappeared down the trail, Eli looked at Josie with a new sense of wonder. She had faced down the town's most notorious gossip without breaking a sweat. His wonder only grew when it came to the mare. She was a beautiful filly, a fiery sorrel with a wild eye and a spirit to match. Eli had bought her cheap, thinking he could break her, but the horse would not be broken. She had thrown him twice and fought every attempt to gentle her with a panicked, violent fury. He had all but given up on her, leaving her in a separate corral, a beautiful, untamable creature. Josie was drawn to her. She began spending hours by the corral, not trying to touch the mare, but simply standing there, speaking in a low, soothing voice. The horse, which shied and snorted at anyone else who came near, would eventually stand still and listen, her ears twitching. "She's just afraid," Josie told Eli one afternoon. "Someone was cruel to her once. She remembers it." "Fear makes an animal dangerous," Eli replied, watching as the mare allowed Josie to come within a few feet of the fence. "Fear makes an animal predictable," Josie corrected him softly. "You just have to learn what it is they expect, and then do the opposite. Slowly, day by day." She won the mare's trust. She would bring her apples, leaving them on the top rail of the fence and backing away. She never moved quickly, never made a sound the horse was not expecting. One day, Eli came out of the barn to see Josie inside the corral. The mare was standing stock still as Josie gently stroked her neck, murmuring words he could not hear. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. It was a kind of magic, a silent communication between two creatures who understood something about being wounded and afraid. Her skill both impressed him and deepened the chasm of his confusion. What kind of boarding school taught a woman to gentle a half-wild horse? Their life fell into a routine of shared labor. They worked from sunrise to sunset, the physicality of the ranch leaving little time for conversation. Yet an intimacy grew in the spaces between words. It was in the way she handed him a cup of coffee in the morning, her fingers brushing his, or the way he would place a steadying hand on her back as she climbed down from the wagon. And at night, in the darkness of the cabin, their bodies spoke a language their tongues could not. He learned the landscape of her skin, the soft sounds she made in the back of her throat. He grew to crave her touch, her scent, the surprising strength in her arms as she held him. But he felt a barrier he could not breach, even in their most intimate moments. He sensed a part of her held in reserve, a core of her being that remained untouched, locked away. One evening, after a full day spent repairing a long stretch of fence on the southern pasture, they were both bone-weary and covered in sweat and dust. The work had been grueling, stretching wire until their muscles screamed in protest. "I'm going down to the creek," Eli announced, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Wash some of this grime off." "I'll come after you," she said. He bathed in the icy water, the shock of it a welcome relief to his aching body. When he returned to the cabin, wrapped in a blanket, the fire was blazing. Josie was gone, her own towel and a clean shift laid out on her cot. He waited, staring into the flames, the day's labor and the night's quiet weaving a strange spell around him. She returned a short while later, her dark hair damp and clinging to her neck, her skin glowing in the firelight. She wore a simple cotton shift, and her bare feet made no sound on the floor. They stood on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire crackling between them. The air was thick with their shared exhaustion and an unspoken, electric tension. Desire, raw and powerful, rose in him, a tide pulling him toward her. He saw the same hunger mirrored in her eyes. She moved first, crossing the space between them in 2 quick strides. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him fiercely. It was not the slow, practiced kiss of their wedding night. This was something else entirely. It was desperate, angry, and achingly tender all at once. It was a kiss that demanded, that took, that confessed a world of hurt and longing. He responded with equal force, his hands tangling in her damp hair, pulling her tight against him. He was losing himself in her, in the storm of her passion. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. She tore her mouth from his, pushing against his chest with surprising strength. She stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes wide with a look of horror and self-loathing. Her emotions were a tangled, violent storm. Shame, craving, and a terrible, heartbreaking tenderness were all warring for control of her face. "Josie?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Don't," she whispered, shaking her head. "Just don't." She fled to her small room, closing the door firmly behind her, leaving him alone and bewildered in the flickering firelight. He did not press her. He was beginning to understand that to push Josie was to lose her. He was starting to suspect that the woman he had married was an invention, a carefully crafted fiction. The real woman was the one he glimpsed in moments like these, in the sadness in her eyes when she thought he was not looking, in the fierce passion of her kiss, and in the profound shame that followed. Whoever she was in pain, and she was hiding. He was afraid that if he clawed at her secrets, she would simply vanish, like a morning mist on the plains. A few days later, the mail rider came by on his monthly route, a welcome break in their isolation. He brought a sack of flour, some salt, and 2 letters. One was from Eli's sister in Ohio. The other was addressed to Mrs. Josephine Whitaker. The script elegant, masculine, and unfamiliar. He handed it to her. The moment her eyes fell on the handwriting, all the color drained from her face. She took the envelope with a hand that trembled slightly, her knuckles white. "Thank you," she said, her voice a thin, tight thread. She turned away from him and walked toward the fire, her movements stiff. She stared at the letter for a long moment, as if it were a venomous snake. Then, without opening it, she tossed it into the flames. Eli watched, speechless, as the paper curled, blackened, and was consumed by the fire. "Josie, what was that?" "Nothing," she said, her back still to him, her voice brittle. "A letter from the past. It's of no consequence." But it was. He saw it in the rigid set of her shoulders and the way she stood staring into the fire long after the letter was gone. The fear did not leave her for the rest of the day. It lingered in her eyes, a dark shadow in their mossy depths. She was jumpy, starting at every sound, the cry of a hawk, the wind rattling the cabin door. She had been found. She knew it. The fortress she had sought in this vast, empty land had been breached. That evening, he found her in the barn. She was in the hayloft, curled up in the shadows, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The sound broke his heart. He climbed the ladder slowly, his heavy frame making the rungs creak. "Josie?" he said softly. She looked up, her face streaked with tears in the dim light. She quickly tried to wipe them away, to reassemble the mask of composure she wore so well. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I was thinking of my family. I miss them." It was a lie. He knew it was a lie, as surely as he knew the sun would set. But he also knew it was the only truth she was able to offer him. He sat down beside her in the sweet-smelling hay. Not too close, giving her space. The barn was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of the animals settling for the night. "It's all right to miss them," he said, his voice a low comfort in the stillness. "It's all right to be sad." Her carefully constructed dam of control finally broke. A fresh wave of sobs shook her, and this time, she did not try to hide them. He did the only thing he could think to do. He reached out and pulled her to him. She resisted for a moment, her body stiff with tension, and then she collapsed against his chest, burying her face in his shirt, her tears soaking the rough cotton. He held her, his large hand stroking her hair, murmuring quiet, meaningless words of comfort. He held her for a long time, until her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. In the warm, hay-scented darkness, surrounded by the quiet life of the barn, something shifted between them. Her grief was real, her pain was real, and his comfort was real. For the first time, there was no pretense, no performance. He was not the unknowing husband. She was not the mysterious bride. They were just a man and a woman, finding solace in a shared moment of raw, unguarded vulnerability. He tilted her chin up, his thumb gently wiping a stray tear from her cheek. He kissed her, and this time, it was different again. It was slow and deep and profoundly gentle. It was a kiss of comfort that slowly deepened into a kiss of passion, a passion born not of desperation, but of a real and growing tenderness. The intimacy that followed in the hayloft was quiet, reverent, and more real than anything they had shared before. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the hay, her head resting on his chest, her body pliant and relaxed against his, she whispered into the darkness. Her voice was so quiet he almost did not hear it, a breath of sound filled with a world of pain and regret. "If you knew the truth, Eli," she murmured, her words a ghost against his skin, "you'd never touch me again." Her whispered words in the hayloft hung in the air between them, a ghost that followed them back to the cabin and into the rhythm of the following days. Eli tried to dismiss them as a product of her tears, a cry of sorrow from a woman who missed a family she never spoke of. But the words had barbs. They had caught in his mind, and he could not shake them loose. He wanted to believe in the fragile peace they had found, in the honest sweat of their shared work, and the quiet tenderness that was blooming in the dark. He clung to the image of the woman who gentled wild horses and whose hands, though increasingly calloused, could still touch his face with a devastating softness. A fortnight later, the supply wagon needed to make its monthly run into Redemption. Their stores of flour, salt, and coffee were low, and he needed to speak with the blacksmith about a new set of shoes for Boulder. Josie offered to go, but he shook his head. The trip was long and tedious, and he found himself wanting to protect her from the prying eyes of the town, from the lingering whispers he knew had not entirely faded. He left at sunrise, the air crisp and clean, promising to be back by nightfall. Redemption was a hive of activity. Eli conducted his business quickly, loading his supplies and arranging the work with the blacksmith, with an hour to spare before he needed to start the long ride home. He found himself standing outside the saloon. He rarely drank, but the trail had been dusty, and his throat was parched. He pushed through the swinging doors, the familiar smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed bodies washing over him. He ordered a beer and stood at the end of the bar, keeping to himself. The noise of the room was a low drone of conversation, punctuated by the click of poker chips and a burst of rough laughter. It was then that he heard it, a voice, loud and gravelly, belonging to a mule skinner holding court in the center of the room. "In Denver, I tell you, it ain't like any other place," the man was saying, wiping foam from his thick mustache. "Got houses there that would make a king blush, the finest women a man could ever want. If he's got the coin. I was hauling freight for a railroad baron. See, and he took me to a place called the Gilded Cage. Saw a girl there I won't ever forget." Eli took a slow sip of his beer, paying the man no mind. "Dark hair," the Skinner continued, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. "Piled up like a queen's, and eyes, green. They were green like a cat's in the dark. Had a mouth that looked like it could either kiss you or cut you, and you'd thank her for either one. Moved like smoke. They called her the Emerald Lady." A few of the men around him chuckled appreciatively, but Eli had gone still, his hand frozen around his glass. Dark hair, green eyes. The description was a casual, brutal sketch of his wife. "What became of her?" another man asked. "Vanished," the Skinner said with a shrug. "About 6 months back, word was the railroad man who kept her, a real powerful fella, got tired of her, or maybe she ran. Women like that, they're like ghosts. Beautiful, but they ain't built to last." A cold knot formed in Eli's stomach. It was a coincidence. It had to be. There must be 100 women with dark hair and green eyes between here and Denver. But the man's words echoed the whispers he'd heard on the day Josie had arrived. "Looks more like a city madam than a rancher's wife." One of the local ranchers, a man named Cobb, whose land bordered Eli's to the north, had been listening. He caught Eli's eye and gave a sly, knowing smirk. "Sounds a little like that new wife of yours. Whitaker, the fancy one you ordered." The saloon fell quiet. Every eye turned to Eli. The air grew thick and heavy. Eli placed his glass down on the bar with a soft, deliberate click. He turned his head and looked at Cobb, his gaze as cold and flat as a winter sky. "You'll watch your tongue when you speak of my wife." "Cobb," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Cobb, a bigger man but not a smarter one, flushed with a mixture of surprise and anger. "No offense intended, just an observation." "Then keep your observations to yourself," Eli said, his voice dropping even lower. He held Cobb's gaze for a long, silent moment, an unspoken promise of violence hanging in the air. Cobb looked away first, muttering into his beer. The mule skinner cleared his throat and changed the subject. The moment passed. Eli threw a coin on the bar, turned his back on the room, and walked out into the harsh light of day. The ride home was a torment. The mule skinner's words played over and over in his head. A vicious, repeating litany. Women like that, they ain't built to last. He tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the familiar rhythm of the horse, the vast emptiness of the plains. But the seed of doubt had been planted in the fertile ground of his own unspoken questions, and it was beginning to sprout ugly, thorny branches. He thought of her hands, so quick and competent at mending and healing, but also of the practiced, knowing way she had touched him on their wedding night, a skill not learned in a loveless boarding school. He thought of her poise, the unshakable calm that had so unnerved Agnes Petty. He thought of the letter she had burned without reading, and the stark terror in her eyes. It all began to connect, to form a picture he did not want to see. When he got home, she was waiting for him on the porch, a silhouette against the setting sun. She took the horse's reins from him, her smile a little too bright, a little too brittle. "You're late," she said. "I was starting to worry." He grunted a noncommittal reply, avoiding her eyes. That night, as she undressed by the firelight, he watched her more closely than ever before. He saw the fine, delicate lace that trimmed the edge of her chemise, a touch of expensive luxury that was completely out of place on this hard-scrabble ranch. Where had a poor, respectable niece gotten such a thing? Later, as they lay together, his hand idly tracing the curve of her spine, his fingers brushed against a series of thin, raised lines just below her shoulder blade. Scars. They were old and silvery white, almost invisible in the dim light. He had felt them before, but had never given them much thought. Now, they seemed like a secret map, a history of pain written on her skin. He wondered what kind of boarding school left marks like that. Josie sensed the shift in him immediately. It was not something he said or did, but something he did not do. He no longer looked at her with that quiet, wondering awe. Now, his gaze was watchful, questioning. The easy silence that had grown between them was replaced by a tense, heavy quiet that suffocated the small cabin. He was a stranger to her again, a judge, and she did not know the crime she was being accused of, only that she was guilty. Her survival instincts, honed by years of navigating the treacherous currents of men's moods, took over. She retreated, pulling the pieces of herself back into the fortress she had inhabited for so long. She became colder, more distant. She answered his questions in clipped, polite monosyllables. She stopped touching him, stopped meeting his eye. The warmth that had begun to thaw the frozen landscape of her heart was gone, replaced by a chilling, familiar frost. She was returning to the armor she knew best, the armor that had kept her alive. That night, when he reached for her in the dark, his touch hesitant, she flinched. It was an involuntary, barely perceptible movement, but to Eli it felt like a slap. He pulled his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. He lay there for a long time, listening to her controlled, even breathing, the sound of a woman who was pretending to be asleep. The rejection was a physical ache in his chest, a confirmation of his darkest fears. He had been a fool, a lonely, desperate fool. He rose from the bed, his movements jerky, and pulled on his trousers. He did not look at her. He went to the cupboard where he kept a bottle of whiskey for medicinal purposes and poured a heavy measure into a tin cup. He drank it down in one long, burning swallow. Then he poured another. He had not drunk like this in months, not since the raw, early days of his grief for Martha. He took the bottle and the cup and left the cabin, the door closing with a soft, final click behind him. He went to the barn, the whiskey burning a hole in his gut, and found a pile of clean hay. He drank until the sharp edges of his confusion and hurt were blurred into a dull, throbbing ache. And then he fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep. He woke with a pounding head and the bitter taste of regret in his mouth. The sun was streaming through the cracks in the barn wall. He felt a deep, profound shame. This was not who he was. He was a man who faced his problems head-on, not one who drowned them in a bottle. He found her by the stove, her back to him, her shoulders rigid. The confrontation he had avoided was now inevitable. He walked to the table and sat down. His hands clasped in front of him, the silence stretched, taut and thin. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. He did not raise it. He did not accuse her. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only a vast, aching confusion. "Josie," he said, his voice cracking on her name. She did not turn around. "I need you to tell me the truth." She remained perfectly still. "That day in town," he went on, the words tasting like ash. "I heard a man talking. He was talking about a woman in Denver, a woman in a fancy house." He could not bring himself to say the word. "He described you." He saw her shoulders tense, but she said nothing. "The lace you wear," he pushed on, his voice pleading. "The scars on your back, the way you are with me. It isn't from a boarding school, is it?" Silence. A terrible, damning silence. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to her, stood behind her, close enough to feel the heat from her body. "Who are you?" he whispered, the question a raw wound. "Who are you really?" Josie squeezed her eyes shut. The truth was a razor blade on her tongue. To speak it would be to sever the last, thin thread of hope she had. She could not do it. She could not bear to see the confusion in his eyes turn to the disgust she had seen in the eyes of so many other men. And so she remained silent, a statue of stone and secrets. The next day, she saddled the sorrel mare. "I need to go to town," she announced, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "There is a telegram I must send." "I'll take you," he said. "No," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I will go alone." She rode out without a backward glance, her back straight, a solitary, defiant figure against the endless plains. In redemption. She dismounted and tied the mare in front of the telegraph office. She was keenly aware of the stares of the townsfolk, the way they stopped and whispered as she passed. The rumors, it seemed, had already taken root. She ignored them, her face a mask of indifference. As she entered the dusty office, a shadow fell across the doorway. A man had been following her. She felt a cold dread snake up her spine. She had been so focused on Eli. She had let her guard down. She turned slowly. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, expensive coat and a bowler hat. His face was handsome in a cold, predatory way, his eyes a pale, calculating blue. A silver-topped cane was clutched in his gloved hand. It was Victor Harper, the railroad magnate, the man who had bought her, used her, and owned her for 3 years. "Josephine," he said, his voice a low, cultured purr that made her blood run cold. "You have led me on quite a chase." "What do you want, Victor?" she asked, her own voice tight. "What do I always want?" he replied, stepping into the office, forcing the clerk to retreat to the back room. "I want what belongs to me. You made a mistake. Leaving Denver, you made a bigger mistake. Thinking you could hide from me in this godforsaken wasteland, playing wife to some dirt-grubbing farmer." "He is a better man than you will ever be," she hissed. A cruel smile touched his lips. "Is he? Does this better man know what you are? Does he know how you earned your keep? Does he know about the men who paid for the very skills you now give him for free?" Each word was a deliberate, poison-tipped dart. "Leave me alone," she said, her hands clenching into fists. "I will not," he said, his voice hardening. "You will pack your bags, and you will come back with me. Your little game is over." He reached out and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her flesh like a manacle. Something inside her snapped. The years of fear, of forced submission, of swallowing her rage, erupted in a single, violent act. She slapped him. Her hand connected with his cheek with a crack that echoed in the small office. His head snapped to the side. He stood there for a long moment, the red print of her hand blooming on his pale skin. When he turned back to her, his blue eyes were chips of ice. The charming facade was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. "You will regret that," he whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "I will not force you to come back. I will simply tell your husband, and this entire pathetic town, exactly what you are. I will peel back your pretty lies one by one, and when I am done, he will throw you out in the dirt where you belong. You will come crawling back to me then. They always do." He released her wrist, shoving her back. Then he turned and walked out, his silver-topped cane clicking on the floorboards. Josie returned to the ranch as twilight bled across the sky. She was bruised, not just on her wrist where Victor's fingers had left their mark, but deep inside, in a place no one could see. She unsaddled the mare, her movements slow, robotic. Eli was waiting for her in the cabin. He saw the dark, ugly mark on her wrist as she reached for a cup of water. He saw the new, deeper shadow of fear in her eyes. But he said nothing. He did not know the words to say. He was lost in a wilderness of doubt, and every path seemed to lead to a fresh hell. That night, she lay beside him in the bed, her body rigid, trembling with a fear so profound it was a palpable thing in the darkness, despite the chasm between them, despite the poison of his suspicions. He could not bear her terror. He rolled onto his side and pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her, drawing her stiff form against the warmth of his body. She resisted for a moment, a wounded animal preparing to fight. And then she went still, though the trembling did not stop. He buried his face in her hair, his voice a low, rough whisper against her ear. "You're safe now." Her reply came out of the darkness, a broken, desolate whisper that shattered the last of his illusions and chilled him to the bone. "No one who's mine ever is." Victor Harper did not arrive in redemption like a storm, but like a plague. He came quietly, under the assumed name of Mr. Vance, a land speculator from the East, he claimed, looking to invest in the territory's future. He took a room at the town's only hotel, a clean but modest establishment, and began his work. His methods were insidious. A slow-acting poison dripped into the town's bloodstream. He did not make grand pronouncements. He bought rounds of whiskey at the saloon. He did not make accusations. He asked leading questions. He found the mule skinner who had first spoken of the Emerald Lady and plied him with expensive liquor, confirming the man's story with a sad shake of his head and a few well-chosen, invented details. "A tragic case," he would murmur, loud enough for others to hear. "A beautiful girl from a good family, fallen on hard times. It breaks a man's heart to see it." He sought out men like Cobb, the rancher who had first taunted Eli, and spoke to them of opportunity, of railroad expansion, hinting that a man of influence like himself could steer things their way, if only they were hospitable to his interests. He never mentioned Josie by name, not at first. He simply painted a vivid picture of a fallen woman from Denver, a woman with dark hair and startling green eyes, and let the town's gossip do the rest. The poison worked quickly. Redemption was a small, isolated community, and a scandal was a feast after a long famine. The whispers that had followed Josie since her arrival grew into a chorus of condemnation. The story twisted and grew with each telling. She was not just a fallen woman. She was a thief, a home wrecker, a disease carrier. The town's latent suspicion of outsiders, especially one as beautiful and poised as Josie, now had a focus. It curdled into a thick, ugly sludge of moral righteousness. Eli and Josie felt the change almost immediately. It was a tangible thing, a drop in temperature, a closing of doors. When Eli went to the general store to purchase a month's worth of supplies on his usual credit, Mrs. Gable, who had known him since he was a boy, suddenly refused him. "Cash only from now on, Eli," she said, not meeting his eye, her face a tight mask of disapproval. "Times are hard." He paid in cash, his jaw tight, the humiliation a hot coal in his stomach. A few days later, he tried to buy a load of hay from a neighboring rancher, a man with whom he had always been on good terms. The man made a flimsy excuse about his own stock needing every last bale, his gaze shifting uncomfortably toward the horizon. The unspoken reason hung in the air between them. Association with Eli Whitaker and his tainted wife was bad for business. The isolation of their ranch, once a source of peace, was becoming a siege. The cruelest blow came the following week. They had to go into town together, a broken wagon wheel forcing the trip. As Josie stepped down from the wagon in front of the blacksmith's shop, a group of loafers who were always perched on the bench outside the saloon fell silent. They watched her, their eyes filled with a leering, contemptuous familiarity. As she walked past, one of them, a lanky youth with cruel eyes, spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust, just inches from the hem of her dress. "Don't want to get any of that filth on you, darling," he sneered. "Might wash some of the Denver off." His companions laughed, a harsh, braying sound. Another man called out a name, a crude, ugly word for a woman of her supposed profession, a word Josie had not heard directed at her in years. Eli moved so fast he was a blur. He grabbed the front of the young man's shirt, lifting him clear off the bench and slamming him against the wall of the saloon. The man's head hit the wood with a solid thud. "You will apologize to my wife," Eli growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. The boy, his face white with shock and fear, stammered an apology, his eyes wide. Eli released him, and the man scrambled away, his friends melting back into the shadows. But the damage was done. Josie stood frozen, her face pale, her expression unreadable. She had not flinched. She had not cried out. She had stood and taken the insult with a cold, terrifying stillness. Her body encased in an armor Eli was only now beginning to understand. He had seen that look on wounded animals, a stillness that came just before they either died or lashed out with everything they had left. The ride home was a long, suffocating silence. The ugly words echoed in the space between them, the spit in the dust, the laughter. When they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brutal strokes of red and orange. The beauty of it felt like a mockery. Eli closed the door behind them, the sound final, definitive. The time for whispers and suspicions, for his own cowardly avoidance, was over. He turned to her. She was standing by the cold hearth, her back to him, still wearing her bonnet, as if she were a visitor who had not yet decided to stay. "Take off your bonnet, Josie," he said. His voice was quiet, but it held a core of unyielding steel. She did as he asked, her movements slow, her hands fumbling slightly with the ribbons. He walked to her, stopping a few feet away. "I want the truth," he said. "Not a piece of it, not a story you think I want to hear. I want all of it, from the beginning." She remained silent, her gaze fixed on the empty fireplace. "I can't fight this if I don't know what it is," he pleaded, his voice cracking with a desperation that surprised him. "I can't defend you from shadows. I saw your face today. You've heard those words before. You've stood like that before. Tell me why." She finally turned to face him. Her green eyes were dark, fathomless pools of old pain. The mask was gone. In its place was a raw, devastating vulnerability. When she spoke, her voice was a dry, broken whisper. "There was no uncle," she began, the first lie falling away like a dead leaf. "There was no inheritance. My name is not Cain." She told him everything. The words came out in a torrent, as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood of poison she had held back for a decade. She told him of her father's death, of a feckless uncle who had sold her at the age of 15 to a man in Denver to settle a gambling debt. She spoke of the Gilded Cage, a place of silk and champagne and profound misery, where girls were trained to be whatever the wealthy men who visited wanted them to be. She spoke of Victor Harper, a man who did not just pay for her time but who believed he owned her, body and soul. She spoke of years of abuse, of learning to smile when she wanted to scream, to feign passion when she felt only revulsion, to build a wall of ice around her heart just to survive. She told him how she had finally escaped, with nothing but a few stolen dollars and a set of fine clothes. She had read of a banker in a remote Colorado town in a newspaper and had concocted a desperate, impossible plan. She had invented the story of a dead uncle and a modest inheritance, gambling everything on a banker's greed and a lonely man's need. "I chose you from a list, mister. Abernathy provided," she whispered, her gaze falling to the floor, unable to bear the look on his face. "Your ranch was the most remote. I thought no one would ever find me here. I thought I could be someone else. Just for a little while." As she spoke, Eli stood as still as a stone. He felt the floor shift beneath his feet, his entire understanding of the world tilting on its axis. He listened to the litany of horrors, the casual cruelty, the systematic destruction of a 15-year-old girl. A profound, sickening wave of disgust washed over him. It was so powerful it made him dizzy, but it was not directed at her. It was disgust for himself, for his own stupid, blind innocence. He had lived his life believing in simple things, hard work, honest dealings, a fundamental fairness to the world. He had believed that while life was hard, people, for the most part, got what they deserved. What had this woman, this child, ever done to deserve this? He felt disgusted with his own petty suspicions, with his wounded pride, with his foolish belief that the world was ever kind or just to a woman with no one to protect her. He looked at her, and he did not see a fallen woman. He saw a soldier who had survived a war he had never known existed. He was stunned into silence. He had no words. What could a man like him possibly say to a life like hers? "I'm sorry," felt like an insult. "It's all right," was a lie. And so he said nothing. He turned, his movements stiff and clumsy, and walked out of the cabin, leaving her standing alone in the gathering dark. For 3 days, he avoided her. He lost himself in the brutal, mindless rhythm of work. He rose before dawn and worked until long after dusk, pushing his body to the point of utter exhaustion, hoping to numb the turmoil in his mind. The cabin became a place of crushing silence. They moved around each other like ghosts, the unspoken truth of her confession a vast, silent ocean between them. He was lost in a storm of his own making. He felt a white-hot, murderous rage toward the faceless men who had hurt her, especially this Victor Harper. He felt a deep, aching guilt, while he had been mourning his gentle, beloved Martha, a woman who had known only kindness. Josie had been enduring a living hell. The injustice of it was a physical weight on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He did not know how to fix it, how to reach her across the chasm of her experience. He was afraid his touch would feel like theirs. His words would sound like theirs. He was afraid of his own clumsy, inadequate goodness. Josie saw his avoidance and his silence, and she interpreted them in the only way she knew how. It was disgust. It was rejection. She had seen it before. She had waited for it. The brief, fragile hope she had allowed herself to feel had been a fool's dream. A man like Eli, a good and decent man, could never truly want a woman like her. The waiting was over. On the morning of the 4th day, she made her decision. She moved with a quiet, resigned purpose. She packed her few belongings back into the worn carpet bag. Her movements were methodical, her face expressionless. There were no tears. She had run out of tears a long time ago. She wrote a short note, leaving it on the table. It simply said, "Thank you." She went to the barn and saddled the sorrel mare. The horse nuzzled her hand, sensing her distress. "It's all right, girl," she whispered, stroking the mare's soft nose. "We'll find another place to disappear." She led the mare out into the pale morning light, ready to ride away, to become a ghost once more. But before she could mount, she saw him. He was at the far end of the corral, fixing a section of fence that had come loose. He was not just fixing it. He was attacking it. His movements filled with a silent, contained fury, stretching the wire with a force that seemed impossible, hammering the staples in with violent, rhythmic blows. She watched him for a long moment, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had to leave now. Before he saw her, she put her foot in the stirrup. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice, low and rough, carried across the corral, stopping her cold. He had not looked up from his work, but he had known. She lowered her foot, turning to face him. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's for the best." He finally stopped, dropping the hammer into the dust. He turned and looked at her, his face grim, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. He walked toward her, his long strides eating up the distance between them until he was standing right in front of her. "No," he said, his voice flat. "It's not." He reached out and took the reins from her unresisting hand. "You're not leaving," he said, the words a vow, a command. "Not again." That night, the silence in the cabin was different. The heavy, oppressive tension was gone, replaced by a fragile, uncertain peace. He built up the fire, and they sat by its light. Not speaking, he looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the labels the world had tried to pin on her, but the fierce, defiant strength in the line of her jaw, the deep, weary wisdom in her eyes. He went to her, kneeling before her chair. He took her hands in his. They were rougher now, the hands of a rancher's wife. He lifted them to his lips and kissed the calluses, the small cuts and scrapes. Then he began to undress her, his movements slow, deliberate, filled with a reverence that was a prayer. He was not taking, he was worshiping. He kissed the old, silvery scars on her back, his lips a balm on the memory of old pain. He made love to her not with pity, but with a fire that was meant to cleanse, to reclaim, to burn away the past and forge something new in its ashes. For the first time in her life, Josie let the walls crumble. She wept in his arms, not the silent, hidden sobs of the hayloft, but deep, ragged, soul-shaking tears. She cried for the girl she had been, for the woman she had been forced to become, and for the unbelievable, terrifying possibility of a future she had never dared to imagine. He held her through it all, his body shielding hers, his presence a solid, unshakable anchor in the storm of her grief. Later, as they lay tangled in the blankets, the fire burning down to glowing embers, she whispered into the darkness, a final test, a final confession of her own brokenness. "You still don't know how I lie." He pulled her closer, his voice a low, sure rumble against her ear, a truth that was more powerful than any lie she had ever told. "I don't care," he said. "I know how you live." The peace they had found was a fragile thing, a sapling growing in the shadow of a volcano. It did not last. Victor Harper was a man unaccustomed to being denied. If he could not reclaim what he saw as his property through manipulation and social ruin, he would use a more direct and brutal language, the language of fire. It began in the dead of night, a week after the confrontation in town. A strange, orange glow against the window of the cabin woke Eli from a deep sleep. He sat up, his senses instantly on high alert. He smelled it then, the acrid, hungry scent of burning hay and dry timber. "Josie, wake up!" he yelled, throwing off the blanket. "The barn!" There was no time for thought, only for action. They burst out of the cabin into a scene from hell. The barn, the structure he had built with his own hands, the heart of their livelihood, was already an inferno. Flames licked up the log walls and poured through the roof. A roaring, monstrous beast against the black, star-filled sky. The terrified screams of the horses trapped inside cut through the night. "The horses!" Josie cried, her face a pale mask of horror in the flickering light. "Get the pump!" Eli shouted, grabbing an axe. "I'll try the corral gate!" They worked with a desperate, frantic synergy, while Eli hacked at the wooden latch of the main corral, which was already scorching hot. Josie worked the iron handle of the water pump with a strength born of pure adrenaline. Soaking blankets he could use as a shield. The heat was a physical blow, searing their lungs, the smoke a thick, choking blanket. Eli, his face shielded by a wet cloth, finally broke the gate open. He charged into the attached corral, his shouts lost in the roar of the fire, slapping and pushing the panicked animals out into the open pasture, away from the flames. Josie, meanwhile, had the presence of mind to run back to the cabin, not for their belongings, but for the essential supplies. She threw sacks of flour, coffee, and beans out the door, along with their rifles and ammunition. She worked with a grim, focused efficiency, her mind clear and cold in the midst of the chaos. This was a different kind of survival, but the instincts were the same. They managed to save all the animals, including the sorrel mare, who galloped into the darkness, her coat gleaming in the firelight. But the barn was a total loss. They stood together, helpless, 100 yards away, and watched it die. The main roof beam groaned, surrendered, and collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks and embers into the night sky. What had taken Eli 2 years to build was gone in less than an hour, leaving only a smoking, skeletal ruin. They had their lives, their animals, and a few sacks of supplies. They had nothing else. At dawn, they rode into redemption on 2 of the horses, their faces smudged with soot, their clothes reeking of smoke. They went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Thompson was a portly man with a perpetually weary expression, a man who preferred a quiet life. He listened to Eli's terse, angry account of the fire, his fingers steepled under his chin. "And you think someone said it?" the sheriff asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "I know someone said it," Eli bit out. "There was no lantern left in that barn, no storm. It was arson." "Who would do such a thing? Eli?" "A man calling himself Vance. He's staying at the hotel. He threatened my wife." Sheriff Thompson sighed, a long, put-upon sound. "Mr. Vance is a respected investor. Eli, a railroad man. He's talking about bringing a spur line through here. He's been nothing but a gentleman." He leaned back in his chair. "You have any proof? Anyone see anything?" "We're 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. Who would have seen anything?" Eli's frustration boiled over. "This isn't a coincidence. Sheriff, the rumors, the trouble in town, and now this. It's him." "Look, son," the sheriff said, his voice taking on a placating tone that was worse than an outright refusal. "I can't go arresting a man of Mr. Vance's stature on your word alone. It was a dry night, a spark from a passing train, a tramp's campfire. It could have been anything. I'm sorry about your barn, but without evidence, my hands are tied." Justice was denied. It was as simple and as brutal as that. The law, which was supposed to protect men like him, was siding with the money and influence of a man like Victor. Eli stood there, his fists clenched, tasting the bitter pill of his own powerlessness. Josie, who had stood silently beside him, placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was a silent command to retreat. There was no winning this fight. Not here, not now. They left the office, the sheriff's empty apologies following them out into the street. They stood by their horses, the morning bustle of the town a world away from the smoking ruin of their home. The injustice of it all was a suffocating weight. "We have to leave, Eli," Josie said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. Her face was etched with a familiar, hunted fear. "This is my fault. He won't stop until he has me or until you're destroyed. We can take the horses, head west. We can start over somewhere he'll never find us." He looked at her, at the genuine terror in her eyes. A terror not for herself, but for him. He saw the life she was proposing, a life on the run, always looking over their shoulders, ghosts in their own lives. He thought of the ashes of his barn, of the sweat and blood he had poured into that unforgiving soil. He thought of the promise he had made to himself and to her in the quiet of their cabin. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He took her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers, a firm, unshakable anchor. "I'm not running. This is my land." He met her gaze, his own eyes burning with a fierce, protective fire. "Our land. We don't run. We rebuild." And so they began. The work was brutal, soul-crushing. They cleared the charred debris, the blackened timbers and twisted metal. They slept under the stars, wrapped in blankets by a small campfire, the cabin feeling too small, too vulnerable. They started felling new trees, stripping the logs, and digging the foundation for a new, smaller barn. They worked in silence for much of the day, their shared purpose a bond stronger than words. Then, a strange thing happened. On the third morning, they woke to find a neat stack of fresh milled lumber near their work site. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. The next day, a heavy canvas wagon sheet, perfect for a temporary roof, appeared. The day after that, it was a sack of nails and a box of coffee. The town, it seemed, had a conscience after all. The ranchers who had shunned him, the neighbors who had turned their backs, were ashamed. They were not brave enough to offer their help in the open, not with Victor Harper's influence hanging over the town. But in the quiet of the night, they offered what they could. The secret acts of kindness were a balm on their wounded spirits, a quiet admission that the community, however flawed, had not completely lost its soul. Josie, too, began to change. As the new barn started to take shape, a new strength began to rise in her. She had spent her life hiding from her past, ashamed of the skills and the knowledge it had given her. Now, watching Eli fight for their home, for her, she realized that her past did not have to be a source of shame. It could be a source of power. It started with Agnes Petty's daughter, a timid girl named Sarah with perpetually frightened eyes and a husband who drank too much. Agnes, in a shocking act of humility, had ridden out to the ranch, not with judgment, but with a desperate plea for help. Josie began to meet with Sarah, and soon with a few of the other ranchers' daughters, in the half-finished shell of the new barn. She did not teach them to sew or bake. She taught them what she knew. She taught them to read, using an old newspaper, showing them how words were power, how the ability to read a contract or a deed could keep them from being cheated, and she taught them how to defend themselves. She showed them how a woman's smaller size could be an advantage, how to use an attacker's weight and momentum against him, how to find pressure points, how to break a grip, how to fight not with fury, but with cold, calculated precision. The young women, raised to be meek and obedient, watched her with wide, astonished eyes. They began to see her not as a fallen woman, but as something else entirely. A survivor, a teacher, a woman of impossible strength. Victor Harper grew impatient. His campaign of whispers and threats had not worked. The fire had not broken them. He saw that he was losing his grip not only on Josie, but on the town itself. He decided a public display of power was needed. He chose a day when the town was crowded, when ranchers from all over the county were in for supplies. He saw Eli and Josie walking down the main street, and he saw his opportunity. He strode out of the hotel, his silver-topped cane clicking on the boardwalk, and blocked their path. "Josephine," he said, his voice carrying across the street, drawing the attention of everyone around. "This farce has gone on long enough. You're coming with me." He reached out, his hand closing around her arm in a grip of iron. Josie did not flinch. She did not cry out. She simply went still, her eyes locking with his, her expression one of cold, utter contempt. Eli moved. He did not say a word. He simply took Victor's wrist in his hand and squeezed. Victor, a man accustomed to having his will enforced by others, was shocked by the raw, physical power in Eli's grip. His fingers went numb, and his hand sprang open, releasing Josie. "You will not touch my wife," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. Victor's handsome face contorted with rage and humiliation. "She is not your wife," he snarled. "She is a piece of property I misplaced, a whore you picked up from the gutter." That was the last word he spoke before Eli's fist connected with his jaw. It was not a clean punch. It was a brutal, brawling blow that sent Victor staggering back, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. The fight that followed was not a duel. It was a beating. Victor was younger and slicker, but Eli was powered by a righteous fury that was terrifying to behold. He fought for his home, for his honor, and for the 15-year-old girl who had been sold into a living hell. He hit Victor with the force of every injustice she had ever suffered, every tear she had ever shed in secret. He left him a bloody, groaning heap in the dust of the main street. A dead silence fell over the town. Eli stood over Victor's broken form, his chest heaving, his knuckles raw and bleeding, and then the town turned. The spell of fear and influence Victor had woven was shattered. In the face of Eli's raw, protective fury, Victor was revealed for what he was, a bully and a coward. Banker Abernathy, his face pale and sweating, pushed his way through the crowd. "He bribed me," he confessed, his voice trembling. "Vance, or Harper, whatever his name is. He paid me to keep quiet, to spread the rumors. He said he had powerful friends. I was afraid." The dam of lies broke. The truth flooded the town. Sheriff Thompson, his face flushed with embarrassment, finally did his duty. Hauling Victor's battered body to the town jail, Eli's name was cleared. That evening, Josie walked to the jailhouse alone. She stood before Victor's cell. His face was a swollen, bruised mess, his expensive clothes torn and filthy. He looked at her with eyes full of pure, undiluted hatred. He was waiting for her to gloat, to curse him, to say something, anything. She looked at him for a long, silent moment, not with hatred or fear or even pity. She looked at him with the calm, quiet finality of a chapter that was finally, truly over. Then she spoke a single word. Survived. She turned and walked out, leaving him to the ruins of his own rage. That night, as she and Eli sat on the porch of their small cabin, a change came over the air. The temperature dropped. A single, perfect snowflake drifted down out of the dark sky. Then another, then 1,000 more. A gentle, cleansing snow began to fall, blanketing the scarred land, the half-built barn, and the entire world in a blanket of pristine, silent white. Eli turned to her in the soft, falling snow. He took her hands in his. "Josie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our first wedding. It was built on a lie. A necessary one. Maybe. But a lie all the same." He looked into her eyes, his own gaze clear and full of a love so profound it made her heart ache. "I want to do it again. I want to marry you properly. No secrets, no lies, just you and me, for the truth of what we are." A tear traced a path down her cheek, a tear not of sorrow, but of a joy so pure and overwhelming she had never known its equal. She looked at this good, strong man, at the home they had fought for, at the new, clean world being born around them in the falling snow. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with the force of her love. "Yes, Eli, yes." The snows of that winter melted into a spring of fierce, green life. The new barn, built of fresh-cut pine that smelled of resin and resolve, stood proud against the sky. The land, as if rewarding their tenacity, gave back everything they asked of it and more. The cattle grew fat on the lush grass. A small vegetable garden Josie had insisted on planting flourished by the cabin. And the ranch, once a lonely outpost of survival, began to feel like a place of abundance. Months passed, flowing one into the next like a clear, steady creek. The rhythm of their life was the rhythm of the land itself, the hard, hopeful work of planting in the spring, the long, sun-drenched days of summer, the golden harvest of the fall. They worked side by side, a silent, efficient team. He was the brute strength, she the keen eye and steady hand. They mended fences, herded cattle, and cleared new pasture, their bodies growing harder, their skin tanned by the sun. And they laughed. It was a sound that had been a stranger to the small cabin, but now it was a frequent guest. It was in the way she would tease him when he got mud on his nose, or the low chuckle in his chest when she stubbornly tried to lift a log that was too heavy for her. The deep, unspoken wounds of their past were still there, but they were no longer gaping and raw. They were scars, and like the land around them, they were healing. Slowly. Surely, they had fought a war and won, and the peace that followed was sweeter than any they had ever known. In the evenings, a new ritual was born. The work of the day done, the cabin would grow quiet, lit only by the soft, golden glow of a kerosene lamp. And Josie would read. She had found a small crate of books left by the cabin's previous owner, and she read them aloud, her voice a low, clear melody in the stillness. She read from Shakespeare, her voice giving life to kings and queens, lovers and fools. She read from books of poetry, the lyrical words painting pictures of worlds far beyond their rugged plains. Eli would sit across from her, his chair tipped back against the wall, his eyes closed, and just listen. He was a man of few letters, his world defined by the tangible things he could see and touch, but her voice was a key, unlocking doors in his mind he never knew existed. He was enthralled, not just by the stories, but by her. He would watch the way the lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the way her brow would furrow in concentration, the small, soft smile that would touch her lips at a beautifully turned phrase. In those quiet moments, he fell in love with her all over again, not for the survivor she was, but for the scholar, the dreamer, the artist hidden within her. One evening in late summer, as the sun was setting, the sky a breathtaking canvas of gold and rose, he came back from watering the horses to find her sitting on the porch steps. She was humming a soft, tuneless melody, and in her lap was a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered from the creek bank, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and delicate white asters. With nimble fingers, she was braiding them into her dark, shining hair. Eli stopped, leaning against the corral fence, and just watched her. She was no longer the pale, haunted woman who had stepped off the train, nor the cold, armored creature who had faced down Victor Harper. This woman was serene, her movements filled with a gentle, unhurried grace. It was a simple, quiet act, this braiding of flowers, but to him, it was profound. It was the act of a woman who felt safe enough to be soft, a woman who believed she had a right to beauty. He looked at her and saw all the women she had been, all the layers of her life. He saw the strength that had carried her through unimaginable darkness. He saw the faint, silvery scars on her back, testaments to a battle he could barely comprehend. And he saw the breathtaking beauty of the woman she was now, a beauty made all the more powerful by the strength and the scars that lay beneath. He was filled with a love so fierce and so tender it was a physical ache in his chest. As the fall approached, a season of harvest and gathering, they decided to host a gathering of their own. It was Eli's idea, but Josie had agreed with a quiet, steady confidence that would have been unthinkable a year ago. They invited all the neighboring families, even those who had once shunned them. It was a barn warming, a harvest festival, and an unspoken declaration that they were no longer hiding. The night of the party was clear and cool. Lanterns were strung from the new barn's rafters, casting a warm, inviting glow. A fiddler from town played lively tunes that set boots to stomping on the new wood floor. The air was filled with the smell of roasting beef and fresh-baked bread, and the sound of laughter. Eli, his face clean-shaven, stood by the door, a proud, quiet host, greeting his neighbors with a firm handshake. But all eyes were on Josie. She wore a simple dress of dark green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair swept up, a few late-blooming wildflowers tucked behind her ear. She moved through the crowd with an easy, unpretentious grace, her smile warm and genuine. She was not playing a role. She was simply herself, and the quiet dignity with which she held herself commanded a new kind of respect. She was no longer Eli Whitaker's mysterious wife. She was Josie, a woman who had taught their daughters to read, a woman who had faced down a powerful man and won, a woman who had, against all odds, become one of them. Late in the evening, a woman approached her, pulling her away from the noise of the party. It was Agnes Petty. Her face, usually so sour and pinched, was soft with an emotion Josie could not immediately place.
Mrs. Whitaker, Josie,
Agnes began, her hands twisting in her apron.
I never apologized for how I treated you when you first arrived. For the things I said, I was a spiteful old fool, and I am truly, deeply sorry.
There's no need, Agnes, Josie said softly.
But there is,
the older woman insisted, her eyes filling with tears.
And that's not all. I came to thank you.
She took a deep, shuddering breath.
My Sarah, you know her husband was a hard man, drank too much, had a mean temper.
What you taught her, Josie, not just the reading, but the other things. You gave her courage. She finally stood up to him. She packed her bags last week and came home to me. She's safe now. Agnes reached out and squeezed Josie's arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. You saved my daughter's life. God bless you." The fiddler struck up a new, lively reel, and the moment was over. Agnes melted back into the crowd, leaving Josie standing there, her heart full. The lessons she had learned in the darkest corners of her life, the skills she had acquired simply to survive, had been used not just to save herself, but to save another. The poison of her past had, at last, been turned into medicine. Later that night, when the last of the wagons had rattled away down the trail, and the ranch was once again quiet under a blanket of brilliant stars, Eli found her by the corral, looking out at the sleeping land. "It was a good night," he said, coming to stand beside her. "It was," she agreed, a soft smile on her lips. He took her hand. "Come with me," he whispered. He led her away from the cabin, away from the new barn, down the familiar moonlit path to the creek. It was the place where they had bathed, separate and apart, after their first day of shared labor, the air between them thick with unspoken things. It was the place where it had all truly begun. The night was cool, but not cold. The sound of the water whispering over the stones was a peaceful song. Under the vast, silent watch of the stars, he turned to her. There were no words needed. They undressed slowly, their bodies pale and beautiful in the soft starlight. They waded into the cool, clear water, the creek washing away the last vestiges of the long, hard day. And there, under the immense, star-dusted canopy of the night sky, they made love. It was not the haunting, desperate passion of their first nights, nor the fierce, reclaiming fire of their reconciliation. This was something else. It was slow and joyful and profoundly peaceful. It was a celebration of everything they had survived, everything they had built. It was the quiet, sacred love of two souls who had found their home in each other. Afterward, they lay on a blanket on the creek bank, wrapped in each other's arms, their bodies still damp, the cool night air on their skin. He propped himself up on one elbow and looked down at her. He traced the line of her jaw, his fingers gentle. Then, his hand moved lower, his touch feather-light, as he traced the old, silvery scars on her back and shoulder. He leaned down and kissed each one, not with pity, but with a deep, reverent love. He was kissing her history, her pain, her survival. He was kissing the warrior who had fought her way to him. A sound bubbled up from deep inside her, a sound he had never heard from her before. It was a laugh, not a small, polite smile, but a real, free, and joyous laugh that seemed to fill the entire night. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. She looked up at him, her green eyes shining in the starlight, clear and bright and full of a love that mirrored his own. She reached up, her hand cupping his cheek, her voice a happy, breathless whisper. No lies this time. The final image of their story is not one of drama, but of peace. It is the image of a woman standing in the cool, gray light of dawn, just as the sun begins to crest the eastern hills, painting the horizon in strokes of pale pink and gold. It is Josie. Her face, framed by loose strands of dark hair, is worn by the sun and the wind, etched with the fine lines of a life that has been hard-fought and hard-won. Her eyes, fixed on the horizon, are fierce and clear. In one hand, she holds a heavy rifle, its wooden stock resting comfortably in her grip, a symbol of the strength she will never again surrender. In her other hand, she holds a steaming tin cup of coffee, a symbol of the simple, daily peace she has earned. She is watching a lone rider emerge from the morning mist, driving a small herd of cattle toward the new barn. It is Eli. He raises a hand in greeting, and she lifts her cup in reply. A small, real smile touches her lips. She is a wife, a rancher, a teacher, a survivor. Her body, once a cage, is now simply her own, loved and cherished. She stands on her land, under her sky, a woman forged in fire and finally, blessedly, free. Thank you for listening to the story. Comment where you are listening from so you can connect with others. And do not forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.